Hello, Mr. Fortune. My name is Miranda, and today I'm excited to teach you of all the components inside the brain. First, starting with the largest part, called the cerebrum. This is what most people think of when they see a brain. The cerebrum not only helps us with senses like sight, hearing, and touch, but it is also responsible for our emotions and learning. The cerebrum can be subdivided into two categories, the right and left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the emotional and creative side of the brain, and the left hemisphere is more analytical and detail-oriented. Although these two hemispheres act differently from one another, they are connected by the corpus callosum and the longitudinal fissure. The corpus callosum is the communication device between these two hemispheres and is located just above the thalamus, runs vertical with the brain, and is slightly curved like a C. The longitudinal fissure is the deep groove that we can visually see separating these two hemispheres. Located right under the cerebrum is the cerebellum. This part of the brain looks like an enlarged peach core and is responsible for our muscle movements, posture, and balance. Just anterior to the cerebellum is the medulla and pons. The medulla is attached to the lower half of the brainstem and is responsible for controlling our heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. Located just above the medulla is part of the brain called pons. Pons relays messages to the cerebellum regarding sleep, swallowing, bladder control, and eye movement. The cerebellum, pons, and medulla are all part of the hindbrain. Overall, the hindbrain helps regulate automatic functions, coordinates movement, and helps with balance and equilibrium. Moving further into the brain, at the topmost part of the brainstem is the midbrain. Just like the name, the midbrain is in the middle of the hind and the forebrain. The midbrain is responsible for motor movements in the eyes and helps process auditory and visual stimuli. Directly above the midbrain starts the forebrain. The forebrain is the largest division of the brain in comparison to the mid and hindbrain. The forebrain includes the cerebrum, thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. With the exception of the cerebrum, which is the majority of the brain, the other parts of the forebrain are in close proximity. The amygdala, thalamus, hypothalamus, and hippocampus are all part of the limbic system located in the forebrain. Starting with the hippocampus, this part of the brain looks like a small curve similar to a stretched out comma. It is responsible for the formation of new memories and retaining old memories. Anterior to the hippocampus is a small circular part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for our emotional response and decision making. Superior to the amygdala is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls our body temperature, hunger, and fatigue. Superior to the hypothalamus is our thalamus. Our thalamus helps with regulation of sleep, consciousness, and how alert we are. These components in the limbic system are all responsible for dealing with emotions, memory, and sleep. Our brains can be subdivided in a few ways. The midbrain, hindbrain, and forebrain are just one way of subdividing these components. The brain is also divided into different lobes. These lobes include the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. These four lobes are also considered part of the cerebral cortex. Starting with the frontal lobe, represented there in pink, this is where we process cognitive skills such as problem solving, memory, and language. One area that specifically focuses on language in the brain is called the Broca's area, represented there in yellow. Posterior to the Broca's area is our motor cortex. The motor cortex helps us plan and coordinate each movement. Also within the frontal lobe is our prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex helps in decision-making, personality expression, and overall cognitive behavior. Separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe is called the central sulcus. A sulcus is the deep groove in the brain and is associated with gyrus. The gyrus is the top fold created in between two sulci. Posterior to the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe, represented here in yellow, receives and processes sensory information from the skin. Located within the parietal lobe is our somatosensory cortex. This cortex is what helps us accomplish processing feelings like touch, pain, and temperature on our skin. Lateral of our parietal lobes are our temporal lobes, represented there in blue. We have one on each side, and they are responsible for auditory perception. Located within the temporal lobe is our auditory cortex. As the name implies, the auditory cortex allows us to hear. Located on the left temporal lobe is the Wernicke's area, which also accidentally fell off. The Wernicke's area is important because it helps us comprehend speech and helps with language development. Lastly, located on the very back of the brain, but above the cerebellum, is the occipital lobe, located there in purple. This is where we process our vision, and this includes the colors, distance, and depth perception. Our brain is a complex structure that can be subdivided into smaller groupings to make identifying parts of the brain easier. I hope you enjoyed this presentation today because our brains are truly incredible. Thank you.